There are moments in history that linger like distant echoes carried by a cold wind across forgotten landscapes. Moments that continue to murmur quietly long after the world has moved on, and if you allow your thoughts to settle into the gentle rhythm of the night, you might almost hear the faint tremor of boots on frozen ground, the slow rumble of engines searching for purpose, and the hurried breaths of men who suddenly realized that fate had led them into a place from which very few would return. Because Stalingrad was never just a battle, but a vast abyss into which humanity stared and saw, with uncomfortable clarity, the fragility of its own existence. Yet this story does not begin with explosions or with winter storms, but with the quiet, deceptive warmth of a summer that shimmered over the wide plains of southern Russia, a summer during which the dust rising behind German columns looked less like a warning and more like the simple sign of an army on the move, and in distant headquarters filled with cigarette smoke and the rustle of maps, decisions were being made, sometimes carefully, sometimes recklessly, that would push two enormous empires toward the darkest convergence of their long and brutal struggle. It was in 1942, as the clouds of the Eastern Front hung heavy and uncertain, that Adolf Hitler studied the map of the Soviet Union with an agitation that almost bordered on desperation, sensing that the grand vision he had imagined was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain with each passing day, for Germany, despite all its steel and its cruelty, was running dangerously low on fuel, relying on the few lifelines of oil flowing from Romania and whatever supplies could still be extracted from conquered territories already battered by war. His generals traced dark arrows toward the southern reaches of the Soviet Union, to the oil fields of the Caucasus, places whose very names promised the industrial lifeblood required to continue the war. But Hitler's gaze, restless and drawn to symbolism as much as strategy, drifted toward another name on the map, a city that stood on the Volga as a manufacturing and transport hub, but whose real significance lay in the fact that it bore the name of his bitter ideological rival, Stalingrad, and the temptation of capturing such a city, even if only for prestige, began to pull at him with the force of an obsession. And so, as plans overlapped, changed, contradicted one another, and strained every available resource, the German armies, stretched thin, weary, tormented by disease and distance, advanced into the southern Soviet Union, unaware of how silently and carefully Stalin prepared his reply far behind the lines, in rooms where no windows were opened, and where candles burned late into the night. The road to Stalingrad began not with a roar, but with the steady hum of engines rising into the warm air on the morning of June 28, 1942, as Army Group South, a long, winding, metallic river of vehicles, tanks, artillery, and soldiers, began moving eastward toward the Volga, and although the operation looked decisive on the maps, it was in truth the first step into a landscape of hidden dangers, distances far too long, ambitions far too large, and supply lines stretched so thin that even the officers could sense a sort of uneasy tremble in the air. As the German columns rolled past dusty villages, some deserted, some trembling with fear, many felt a strange déjà vu, for the offensive mirrored in unsettling ways the previous summer's campaign, the one that had ended in disaster as the winter descended, freezing tens of thousands of men and immobilizing entire divisions. And although the sun now shone brightly, anyone with memory or imagination could sense the shadow of that coming winter already lurking at the edge of the horizon. With each passing day, the German spearheads pushed deeper into Soviet territory, but the supply lines behind them grew ever longer, winding across plains that seemed limitless, and across roads barely worthy of the name. And soon, fuel shortages forced delays, food shortages became common, and some German troops, unable to continue otherwise, slaughtered their own exhausted horses and consumed the meat in silence, unaware that this grim necessity was only a faint preview of the suffering that awaited them once they reached the Volga. Meanwhile, Stalin watched grimly as town after town fell to the advancing Germans, but behind this outward anxiety he was shaping a response that was as ruthless as it was simple, a decree that demanded discipline through fear and survival through sheer stubbornness. Order No. 227, the order that allowed no retreat, not even a single step, and its words, harsh, uncompromising, absolute, began to echo across Soviet ranks, creating an invisible wall of defiance in front of the German advance. For whatever the Red Army lacked in supplies, it would compensate for with a willingness to endure. And so, under the weight of summer heat and the shifting dust of endless roads, both armies sensed, even if faintly, that they were being drawn towards something far larger than a simple objective on a map, that the city ahead, still distant, still untouched, would soon become the stage for a struggle so immense, so consuming, that it would crush not only bodies and buildings, but entire illusions about how far human endurance could be pushed before breaking. As the German advance carried on through July, the shimmering heat of the plains slowly gave way to a faint, distant silhouette on the horizon, a cluster of chimneys, smokestacks, and sprawling factories rising from the banks of the Volga. And although Stalingrad was still many kilometers away, its presence began to shape the mood of the approaching troops, for even those who had not yet seen the city felt its weight, an almost nameless pressure that settled on them with each passing mile. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German Sixth Army, was a man known for his discipline and precision, traits admired in times of order, but tested in moments of chaos, and as his forces pushed closer to Stalingrad, he became acutely aware of how fragile the momentum had become, how the long supply lines crackled with strain, how the horses were dying faster than they could be replaced, and how disease, typhus, and dysentery moved through the German ranks with the same merciless efficiency as any Soviet counterattack. Yet, despite these early signs of trouble, the high command in Berlin grew more impatient, more ambitious, more determined to seize the city, and on July 23rd, Hitler issued the formal order to take Stalingrad, a command that would ripple through every German division and turn what had once been a secondary objective into the central obsession of the entire southern front, redirecting resources, attention, and human lives toward a single point on the map. On the Soviet side, the preparations grew urgent and almost frantic, though always wrapped in the appearance of firm discipline. Factories deep in the city worked night and day, pouring out tanks, rifles, and shells, while reinforcements arrived from distant fronts, their boots worn and their faces drawn, yet carrying with them the undeniable conviction that Stalingrad must not fall, because the river behind them was wide and cold, and retreat was no longer simply forbidden, it had become unthinkable. Civilians, too, found themselves drawn into the tightening spiral of war, for as the threat grew nearer, thousands of ordinary men and women were ordered to dig trenches, build fortifications, and work exhausting shifts in makeshift armament workshops, their daily routines breaking apart and reshaping themselves around the rhythm of a city, preparing not for survival, but for siege, a siege that none could yet imagine in its full horror. Late in August, as the Germans approached the outskirts of the city, the Luftwaffe appeared in the sky with a roar that seemed to tear open the horizon, and for days the bombers unloaded their cargo onto Stalingrad, turning entire neighborhoods into burning fields of rubble, filling the air with dust so thick it clung to the lungs, and leaving behind an eerie, trembling silence broken only by the crackle of flames and the scattered cries of survivors searching through the ruins for loved ones they would never find. Between 40 and 75,000 civilians died in the opening bombardments alone, a number that, even whispered, feels too heavy to hold. And yet this was only the beginning, for the German spearheads soon reached the northern part of the city, driving forward with the mechanical determination of an army, convinced it stood on the edge of victory, unaware that this first touch of Stalingrad was not an achievement but a threshold, and that beyond it lay a place where normal rules of warfare dissolved into something far more primitive, intimate, and unforgiving. As German units pushed closer to the Volga, Soviet defenders clung to every street and building, fighting with a ferocity born from desperation and duty, and it became clear that what awaited inside the city would not be a swift breakthrough, but a slow descent into a labyrinth of shattered factories, collapsing houses, and improvised fortresses where every brick, every shadow, and every room might hide a conflict waiting to erupt. And so, with smoke rising into the summer sky, and the distant echoes of battle beginning to resonate across the ruined streets, both armies stepped into a new phase of the struggle, one that would soon erase the line between soldier and survivor, between attack and endurance, and would trap them all within the unforgiving embrace of a city destined to become the gravestone of an entire generation. As September settled over Stalingrad, carrying with it the first cool breaths of approaching autumn, the Germans pushed deeper into the city, only to discover that the destruction they had caused now worked against them, for the bombed-out buildings, the collapsed streets, and the shattered factories formed a strange and hostile landscape, where movement became uncertain, vision became limited, and every step felt like an invitation to an unseen danger lurking behind a broken wall or a darkened stairwell. General Vasily Churikov, newly appointed commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, understood almost instinctively that the only way to resist the superior firepower of the Germans was to eliminate the distances between them, to close the space so tightly that German aircraft and artillery could no longer distinguish friend from foe, and so he instructed his men to fight as close to the enemy as humanly possible, sometimes no more than a single wall, a single doorway, or a single breath away. This tactic, soon known as hugging the Germans, transformed the streets of Stalingrad into a series of brutal and intimate battles, where soldiers grappled inside the same rooms, exchanged fire across the same hallways, and bled onto the same floors, while the city itself seemed to shrink around them, pressing in like an iron cage that gave no space for retreat and no moment for rest. The Luftwaffe continued its bombardments, but the very devastation it inflicted created a labyrinth of hiding places for the Soviets, who used collapsed walls, underground passages, and heaps of rubble as improvised fortifications. And as the Germans advanced street by street, block by block, they found themselves slowed, exhausted, and confused by a city that now seemed determined to resist them at every turn. By September 13th, the Germans had reached the heart of Stalingrad, driving toward key positions along the riverbank, and soon they captured towering mounds of rubble that once had been apartment blocks and administrative buildings, gaining vantage points from which they believed victory was only a matter of time. Yet the Soviets refused to yield, launching counterattacks so frequent and ferocious that even experienced German officers described the fighting as something beyond human comprehension. Among the most famous defensive points was the grain elevator, a massive concrete structure that rose above the surrounding ruins like a lone monument to defiance, and inside it, a small Soviet garrison of barely 50 soldiers held off repeated German assaults, refusing every offer to surrender, fighting until their ammunition was gone and their food exhausted, and even then resisting with such determination that German reports later insisted they were facing not dozens but hundreds of defenders. As the battle raged around the grain elevator, another fortress emerged in the shape of an ordinary apartment block, later immortalized as Pavlov's house, where Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and his men fortified the building in layers so dense and cunning that it became a self-contained citadel, holding out for nearly 2 months under constant attack, its windows becoming firing slits, its stairwells turning into corridors of death, and its rooftop a perch where Soviet snipers waited with steady breath and unwavering patience. Throughout September, the Germans managed to seize nearly 2/3 of the city, carving deep lines into Soviet defences and inching ever closer to the Volga, whose slow waters reflected the flames of burning factories and the silhouettes of exhausted men ferrying supplies across the river under artillery fire. And yet, even with this progress, something subtle began to shift in the rhythm of the battle, a faint tremor that suggested the German advance was slowing, that their strength was thinning, and that the vast machine of their war effort had begun to grind against its own limits. For while they held much of the city, they did so with units that were battered, depleted, and straining under the weight of constant urban combat. And the Soviets, though suffering equally, kept receiving reinforcements that crossed the Volga at night, slipping through fire and smoke to join the defense, bringing with them not only weapons and numbers, but a sense that the tide, though not yet turning, had begun to resist the pull toward defeat. And so, as the nights grew colder, and the winds from the steppes carried hints of the winter to come, both armies settled into a grim, grinding struggle inside the broken bones of Stalingrad, each waiting for an opening, a mistake, or a miracle, unaware that far beyond the city, in the quiet offices of the Soviet High Command, a plan was taking shape, one that would soon break the stalemate and plunge the Germans into a catastrophe from which they would never recover. As October unfolded over Stalingrad, bringing with it colder nights and a thin veil of frost settling onto the shattered stones of the streets, the battle inside the city began to shift into a slower, heavier rhythm, a kind of suffocating struggle in which every meter gained cost blood, exhaustion, and the last reserves of human willpower, and the Germans, who had once moved with speed and confidence, found themselves now advancing in tiny increments, pausing at every intersection, every doorway, every mound of rubble, for fear of the unseen defenders waiting just beyond their line of sight. General Paulus, his maps increasingly cluttered with red arrows showing Soviet counterattacks, and blue arrows indicating German gains that seemed to shrink each day, understood that he was fighting not only the Red Army but the city itself, a place that no longer resembled a human settlement, but rather a vast wreckage of concrete and twisted metal that offered endless hiding places for snipers, machine gunners, and men who refused, with a kind of quiet, stubborn resolve, to let the invaders pass. In the industrial district to the north, the fighting grew particularly brutal, for the Germans were determined to seize the factories that dominated the landscape: the Red October steel plant, the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, and the barricaded gun works, massive complexes of broken walls, skeletal machinery, and cavernous halls in which sound echoed and visibility was poor, allowing the Soviets to melt into the shadows, regroup, and strike from angles impossible to predict. For days on end, German soldiers battled through machine rooms, littered with destroyed equipment, assembly floors turned into killing zones, and basements where shells had carved out new entrances and exits, while above them snipers hidden in cranes and gantries kept a constant, patient watch, their rifles steady even as the wind cut sharply across the open metal structures. The Luftwaffe attempted to support the ground troops with bombing runs, but the very ruins they created made targeting nearly impossible, and so the bombardments often resulted in little more than clouds of dust and debris that stung the eyes, clogged the lungs, and obscured friend and foe alike, turning each attack into a swirl of confusion in which soldiers stumbled chaotically through half-collapsed rooms without knowing where enemy lines truly began or ended. Meanwhile, the Soviet defenders continued to cross the Volga in small boats, mostly at night, paddling through icy waters lit only by distant fires burning along the riverbank, and many of these boats never reached the shore, struck by German shells or machine gun fire, yet enough men arrived each night to keep the 62nd Army alive, to replenish the front lines, and to remind the Germans that Stalingrad was not a city prepared to surrender, but one still very much alive beneath its ruins. As the days passed, the battlefront inside the city evolved into a strange patchwork of isolated pockets, where Soviet troops held out in single buildings surrounded entirely by German units, and German detachments struggled to hold trenches that were only meters away from Soviet counterpositions, and sometimes the fighting grew so close that soldiers on both sides could hear each other breathing through the thin walls that separated them. Among the German officers, whispers began to spread, quiet, uneasy conversations about the worsening supply lines, the thinning ranks, the relentless Soviet resistance, and the cold that now settled deeply into boots, gloves, and bones, hinting at a winter far harsher than any of the men had yet experienced. But if the Germans felt the pressure of a city that refused to fall, the Soviet High Command saw in that stubborn resistance the opportunity they had been waiting for. And behind the lines, far from the shattered buildings of Stalingrad, Stalin, Zhukov, and Vasilevsky were finalizing a plan that had been developing silently for months. A vast encirclement operation intended to trap the entire German Sixth Army inside the ruins they had fought so hard to enter. Operation Uranus. Its details, though closely guarded, were simple in concept and devastating in execution. The Germans, exhausted and overconfident, had placed their weaker Romanian and Italian allies along the flanks north and south of Stalingrad, positions that would soon be struck with overwhelming force by fresh Soviet armies waiting patiently in the snow-covered steppe. And so, as October drew to a close and the German lines strained under constant pressure within the city, few realized that the ground beneath them was shifting, slowly but inevitably, toward a catastrophe that would soon change not only the fate of Stalingrad, but the entire trajectory of the war. As November crept into the ruins of Stalingrad, carried on winds colder and sharper than anything the soldiers had yet endured, the city seemed to exhale a long, weary breath, a momentary stillness settling over the front lines like a blanket of frost. And in that fragile quiet, neither the Germans nor the Soviets could fully grasp that the most decisive phase of the battle was only hours away, waiting patiently beyond the horizon of the steppe. For nearly a month, while the Germans pressed forward inside the city with dwindling strength, the Soviet High Command had been gathering its forces in the vast open plains north and south of Stalingrad, assembling armies that stretched across the white fields like a silent tide. Their tanks covered in sheets of frost, their artillery positioned carefully behind ridges, and their infantry standing in long, unmoving lines, trying to stay warm as they awaited the order that would change the course of the war. General Zhukov and General Vasilevsky had shaped their plan with both precision and audacity, understanding that the German Sixth Army, so deeply entangled in the urban maze of Stalingrad, had become dangerously isolated, protected on its flanks not by hardened German divisions but by Romanian and Italian units, brave but under-equipped, stretched thin, and entirely unprepared for the storm that was about to fall upon them. Just before dawn on November 19th, under a sky the colour of pale steel, the quiet of the steppe shattered as thousands of Soviet guns opened fire in unison, their thunder rolling across the frozen ground like an earthquake, and the shells screamed through the air before crashing onto positions held by the Romanian Third Army, tearing trenches apart, flipping vehicles over as though they were toys, and sending waves of shock and panic rippling down the defensive lines. Moments later, columns of Soviet tanks began to advance, their engines growling through the cold, their tracks grinding through snow and mud, and behind them marched infantry units wrapped in great coats, their faces pale from the cold but their steps steady, pushing forward into a front that was collapsing faster than anyone in the German High Command could comprehend. The Romanian forces, already battered by weeks of skirmishing and entirely outmatched in both firepower and armour, were overwhelmed in mere hours, their lines bending, then breaking, then disintegrating into scattered groups trying desperately to retreat toward the west. But the Soviet tide moved too swiftly and too decisively, flowing past them and encircling entire sectors before the Germans could react. Back in Stalingrad, General Paulus received the first reports with a sense of disbelief, for he had been assured repeatedly by Berlin that the flanks were secure and that no large Soviet forces remained capable of a major offensive. Yet as more messages arrived, each more alarming than the last, it became clear that something catastrophic was unfolding beyond the edges of the city. The next day, November 20th, the Soviets launched a second massive offensive, this time striking the Romanian Fourth Army south of Stalingrad with equal ferocity, once again overwhelming defences that had neither the equipment nor the depth to absorb such a blow, and within hours the southern flank, too, buckled and broke, allowing Soviet armoured spearheads to race toward the river Don and beyond. Over the course of just 3 days, the Soviet pincers, one advancing from the north, the other from the south, moved steadily toward one another, closing the distance through blizzards and gunfire. Until on November 23rd, near the town of Kalash, the two fronts finally met in a moment that seemed almost quiet in its inevitability, completing the encirclement of nearly 300,000 Axis troops trapped inside Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, once the pride of Hitler's Eastern campaign, found itself suddenly cut off from the outside world, surrounded by snow, rubble, and an enemy that showed no intention of allowing escape. And what had once been an offensive operation now transformed, almost instantly, into a desperate struggle for survival. Inside the pocket, the realization spread slowly but unmistakably. There would be no easy way out, no swift relief, no immediate rescue, and as German soldiers stared out across the frozen landscape, watching the distant flashes of Soviet artillery, a deep and chilling truth settled over them. They were trapped in Stalingrad, and winter had arrived to seal the door behind them. When the jaws of the Soviet encirclement finally snapped shut around the German Sixth Army, sealing Stalingrad off from the outside world like a tomb beneath the winter sky, there was a moment, brief, fragile, almost hopeful, in which the men inside the pocket waited for orders that might free them, believing that a breakout would surely be authorized, that mobility and initiative would return to them, and that the disaster forming around their edges could still be escaped with speed and discipline. But instead of a call to break through the tightening ring of Soviet armor, General Paulus received a different directive, one that drifted down the chain of command with an air of unreality, almost dreamlike in its wishful detachment from the facts on the ground. The Sixth Army would hold its ground, dig in, and wait to be supplied from the air. The airlift. Hitler, reassured by the bold promises of Luftwaffe Chief of Staff Hans Jeschonek, convinced himself that the Sixth Army could be sustained with daily air deliveries, 500 tons of food, fuel, ammunition and medical supplies falling onto the encircled city each day, enough to keep Paulus's vast force alive through the winter until a relief operation could reach them. But the truth, quiet and merciless, settled over Stalingrad almost immediately. The airlift had no chance of success. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin across the Eastern Front, lacked the aircraft, the fuel and the clear winter skies required to meet the promised tonnage, and in the first days of the operation, the deliveries fell dramatically short. Not 500 tons, not 300, but barely a fraction of what the army required just to stay alive. Inside the pocket, German soldiers lined up beside makeshift airstrips, watching the thin silhouettes of transport planes emerge from the clouds like exhausted birds, only to see many of them turn back, crash in the snow, or drop their supplies miles from their intended targets, where Soviet troops quickly gathered them up like trophies offered by the wind. Food rations dwindled with terrifying speed, shrinking from portions meant to sustain men to portions barely suitable for survival, until bread made from frozen flour and sawdust became a luxury, and the daily meals dissolved into thin soups that tasted of nothing but water and despair. Horsemeat, once a reluctant necessity for marching soldiers, became the most coveted dish in the encircled city, and when the last of the horses were slaughtered and consumed, the men turned to whatever remained, scrapings of fat, boiled belts, stolen crumbs, anything that could keep the cold from hollowing them out from within. Hospitals, if they could still be called that, overflowed with the wounded, men lying in unheated buildings on frozen floors, their breath rising in small white clouds as overworked medics moved among them with hands trembling from exhaustion, trying to tend wounds that festered in the cold, or to comfort men whose fevers rose uncontrollably in the darkness. Outside, frostbite spread with the same slow inevitability as hunger, turning fingers black, stiffening limbs, and stealing the strength from men who could no longer stand guard for more than a few minutes before the cold carved its way through their clothing, their boots, and finally their flesh, leaving behind numbness that felt almost peaceful until it became deadly. And still, even as conditions worsened day by day, Hitler refused Paulus's requests to break out, insisting that the Sixth Army remain in Stalingrad, insisting that the airlift would succeed, insisting that relief was coming, relief that in truth could not reach them in time. Manstein's long-awaited counteroffensive, Operation Winter Storm, began on December 12th, and for a brief flickering moment the possibility of rescue returned to life, as German armoured divisions pushed across the steppe, drawing closer and closer to the pocket, their engines roaring through the cold as though they were racing not only against the Soviets but against time itself. But the advance slowed, stalled, and finally stopped, pinned down by Soviet forces who had anticipated the move and reinforced their lines with a calm, calculated precision. And as the guns fell silent and the tanks sank into snowdrifts, just 48 kilometers from the edge of the encirclement, the truth became impossible to ignore. The Sixth Army would not be saved by outside hands. Inside Stalingrad, General Paulus received the message with a kind of quiet resignation, for by then the men were already dying faster than he could report their numbers, and their once proud divisions had been reduced to thin, hollow ghosts wrapped in tattered uniforms, shivering in the ruins of a city that had consumed everything they had brought with them. And yet, even in the face of starvation, frostbite, and the endless whistle of Soviet shells drifting through the night air, Paulus still did not have permission to move, for the order from Hitler remained unchanged: hold Stalingrad no matter the cost, no matter the suffering, no matter how impossible the situation had become. Thus the Sixth Army waited, cold, hungry, surrounded, clinging not to hope but to routine, to discipline, to the faint belief that somehow, somewhere, a decision would be made that would allow them to escape the tightening grip of the city before it closed forever. As the final weeks of 1942 slipped quietly into the frozen stillness of January, the encircled German troops inside Stalingrad began to drift into a kind of twilight existence, a grey and suspended state between endurance and collapse, where days blended into one another beneath the dull glow of a winter sun that seemed unable to warm even the edge of the horizon, and nights stretched out long and silent except for the distant rumble of Soviet artillery echoing over the ruins like a heartbeat, reminding them that the circle surrounding them was very much alive. Food had become so scarce by now that soldiers no longer spoke of hunger as a sensation but as a constant companion, a quiet presence sitting beside them, whether they stood guard along the broken avenues of the city, or huddled close to small fires made from splintered furniture, stripped from abandoned homes, and even these fires burned fitfully, their flames small and fragile in the biting wind that crept through every crack in every wall. Medical stations, once organized with efficiency, had become little more than dim, overcrowded shelters where wounded men lay shoulder to shoulder on the icy floors, their bandages stiff with frost, their breath rising in faint clouds that hung in the cold air before dissolving into the shadows above. And the doctors, those who still had the strength to work, moved slowly among them, offering what care they could, though supplies had run dry and morphine, once a small mercy, had become a rare luxury. With each passing day, more soldiers succumbed not to bullets or shells but to exhaustion, and the relentless cold, their bodies weakening as fats and muscles were consumed simply to keep their hearts beating. And sometimes patrols found men sitting upright against ruined walls, as if resting, only to discover that the cold had taken them softly during the night, leaving their faces serene, almost peaceful, as though they had finally stepped into a warmth that had eluded them for weeks. General Paulus received reports that were increasingly bleak, each dispatch a reminder that his army, once 300,000 strong, had dwindled to a fraction of that number, and many of those who remained could no longer march, fight, or even stand. Yet despite these messages, despite the thin lines on his situation, maps that curved inward like shrinking lungs, he remained bound by the same unyielding orders that had guided him since November, orders not to break out, not to retreat, not to surrender. Outside the pocket, the world continued to move with a momentum that the soldiers inside Stalingrad could barely imagine, and on the vast frozen steppe, the the Soviets tightened their positions with calm, deliberate calculations, reinforcing their lines, strengthening their artillery emplacements, and sending forward reconnaissance teams that moved silently through the snow, observing, waiting, preparing for the next phase of the encirclement. Inside the city, the Germans listened each day for the sound of aircraft engines, hoping that the Luftwaffe might once again puncture the clouds and bring supplies. But as the month progressed, the airlift faltered under worsening weather, fierce Soviet resistance, and the simple impossibility of delivering enough material to feed an entire army, so that sometimes only a handful of planes managed to reach the city, dropping crates that shattered upon impact or drifted into Soviet lines, vanishing into the darkness. And yet, even as hopes dimmed, even as the cold crept deeper each night, the German positions did not collapse all at once, but eroded slowly, gently, like ice thinning under a relentless winter sun, and the soldiers, though weary and starving, still clung to their routines, their trenches, their orders, perhaps because they had nothing else left to cling to, perhaps because the mind, when faced with despair, often chooses duty as the last refuge of meaning. But beneath this fragile facade of discipline, an unspoken realization began to settle through the ranks, like snow drifting softly through the broken rafters of the city. The Sixth Army was no longer fighting to take Stalingrad, nor to hold it, nor even to survive long enough to be rescued, but simply to endure one day longer, then another, and then another, with no clear sense of what lay beyond the next sunrise or whether any sunrise yet mattered. And still, winter deepened, tightening its hold on the city, turning the ruins into a frozen labyrinth of white dust and silent shadows, while far to the west in Berlin, decisions continued to be made by men who would never feel the cold that gnawed at the bones of the soldiers trapped on the Volga's frozen edge. As January deepened across the ruins of Stalingrad, bringing with it winds so sharp they seemed to carve through uniforms and skin alike, the German Sixth Army slipped further into a realm where time itself felt distorted, days bleeding into one another beneath a sky, the color of old iron, and nights stretching endlessly, as soldiers waited for sounds that came too rarely. Airplanes overhead, a distant engine turning, a voice on the radio that did not speak of shortages, failures, or death. General Paulus, who had once commanded with crisp efficiency, now spent long hours studying the maps laid out before him, though the lines and symbols had begun to blur, because the front no longer behaved like anything drawn in ink. Instead, it shifted like a dying organism, shrinking inward in uneven spasms as each part of his army withered under the combined pressure of cold, hunger, and relentless Soviet attacks. Communications, once the lifeline of every coordinated military action, had become fragile threads, snapped by bombardments or silence or the simple disappearance of entire units, whose positions were now marked on the map only by absence, and Paulus found himself sending messages into a void, uncertain whether they reached Manstein, uncertain whether Manstein's replies were real or delayed, or merely reassurances filtered through too many layers of hope and obligation. The Soviets, meanwhile, sensing the weakening structure of the German defences, tightened their movements with the patience of craftsmen, assembling artillery batteries that fired with unhurried precision, creeping infantry detachments forward through the snow, and cutting off roads and corridors that had once allowed the Sixth Army to move supplies and wounded between its northern and southern pockets. Inside the encirclement, those pockets had grown so isolated from one another that soldiers in one district no longer knew whether their comrades a few streets away were still alive, and rumours drifted through the frigid air like restless spirits, rumours of entire regiments wiped out overnight, of positions abandoned without orders, of officers who no longer had men to command and walked from bunker to bunker, searching for units that had vanished into the darkness. In the headquarters beneath a battered department store, Paulus received a series of messages from Berlin that felt increasingly detached from the world he inhabited, messages insisting that he hold his ground, that he trust in the shrinking airlift, that relief would come, and still more messages warning him that any negotiation, any thought of capitulation, any step towards surrender was forbidden. For a German field marshal, should he be promoted, must never allow himself to be taken alive. Across the front, the wounded continued to accumulate in freezing shelters, lying in rows so close that when one man breathed, the frost from his exhalation drifted gently onto the face of another, and doctors struggled to perform even simple treatments with supplies that were almost entirely gone, using scraps of cloth for bandages and holding tiny fires in metal tins just to thaw their instruments. Starvation carved deep hollows into the faces of the soldiers, their cheeks drawn tight against their skulls, their movements slow and heavy as they rationed the last crumbs of food, some sharing what little remained with comrades who could no longer rise from the floor, while others drifted into a dazed silence, staring at the frozen walls as though listening for something beyond the wind. And through all of this, the cold continued its quiet assault, settling into bones, numbing fingers, until they no longer responded, and creating a strange, deceptive sense of warmth in those closest to collapse, leading exhausted men to remove their gloves or open their coats, as if their bodies were convincing them that the freezing air around them was soft and welcoming, a final delusion before unconsciousness overtook them. Soviet patrols pushed closer with each passing day, moving cautiously through the ruins, encountering German positions that offered only weak resistance or none at all, and in some sectors they advanced without firing a single shot, stepping over abandoned weapons, makeshift ovens built from bricks, and shallow graves partially covered by drifting snow. By mid-January, Paulus could no longer deny what had become painfully clear. The Sixth Army was no longer an army in any meaningful sense, but a collection of isolated clusters of men, some barely armed, many unable to stand, who clung not to victory nor to strategy, but simply to the instinct to endure another hour, another night, even though the horizon no longer held the promise of rescue. Yet despite this collapse, despite the haunting silence that settled over sectors that once bustled with activity, orders from Berlin remained unchanged, and Paulus found himself suspended between duty and impossibility, trapped in a space where every option led deeper into the same frigid nightmare, aware that decisions made far away were shaping the fate of men who no longer had the strength to shape their own. And so, with the lines unraveling and the cold setting deeper into every corner of the city, Stalingrad entered its final movement, not yet resolved, not yet surrendered, but shifting slowly toward an ending that could be felt long before it arrived, like the dim, distant tolling of a bell heard through snow and smoke. As January moved toward its final days, the encircled ruins of Stalingrad seemed to fall into a silence so deep that even the distant thunder of artillery felt muted, softened by the endless drifts of snow that now covered the city like a pale shroud, and the men within the pocket moved slowly through this frozen stillness, their bodies weakened, their minds dulled by hunger, and their thoughts circling endlessly around the same questions for which no answers ever came. In the northern sector, where shattered factories still cast long, skeletal shadows across the snow, small groups of German soldiers clung to their positions with a kind of automatic obedience, no longer expecting relief, no longer forming plans, but simply holding the ruins around them because it was what they had been told to do, and in the absence of strength or purpose, obedience was the one thing that demanded no energy, no hope, only habit. Across the riverbank districts, where the wind blew fiercely through the broken windows of empty apartment blocks, Soviet troops advanced cautiously, pausing frequently to listen, to check for movement, to scan the rooms and halls for signs of resistance, yet often finding only silence. Rooms strewn with abandoned kit, cooking pots half filled with frozen broth, or notes written in shaky handwriting, and left behind by men too weak to continue fighting. Inside the German headquarters, the atmosphere had become so heavy and airless that conversations drifted into whispers, and even those whispers felt weighed down by the knowledge that they carried little meaning anymore. For the situation maps before Paulus no longer reflected strategy or possibility. only a tightening spiral of Soviet lines pressing inward, sector by sector, leaving only narrow corridors that shrank each day. Messages from Berlin arrived less frequently now, and when they did, they felt detached from the reality that surrounded the Sixth Army, filled with exhortations to hold positions that no longer existed, encouragements to trust an airlift that had already dwindled to a trickle, and reminders of duty addressed to men who now struggled to stand, let alone fight. Supplies dropped from the sky had become so rare that soldiers would gather beneath the chalky winter clouds and stare upward, listening for the distant hum of engines that too often never came. And when a plane did appear, weaving through anti-aircraft fire and icy winds, the men would watch it with a kind of desperate reverence, knowing that whatever fell from its hold, crates of ammunition, sacks of frozen bread, even bundles of rags, might decide who survived another day. Yet even these small miracles brought with them a quiet sorrow, for each scattered drop of supplies revealed how little the airlift could truly accomplish, providing just enough to delay collapse, never enough to prevent it. And each time soldiers scrambled across the snow to gather fragments of food or fuel, the sight of their thin arms, frost-bitten hands, and trembling movements made it clear that they were no longer racing for survival, but for moments of borrowed time. In many positions, the lines had fallen so close together that German and Soviet soldiers could hear one another through the walls of ruined buildings. And on some nights, when the wind was low and the firing subsided, faint voices drifted through the darkness, a cough, a moan, an indistinct murmur, and though neither side would acknowledge it openly, there was something profoundly human in those distant sounds, a reminder that beyond orders and uniforms, both sides were simply men struggling against a winter that devoured all distinctions. Soviet commanders, aware of the growing fragility of the German defences, continued to prepare for a final push, assembling divisions around the shrinking perimeter with a deliberate patience that reflected both caution and confidence, while political officers reminded their troops that victory was near, that the defenders were weakened beyond recovery, and that each day the ring tightened, even if slowly, even if quietly. Inside the pocket, German officers moved through their dwindling ranks with a somber calm, offering encouragement where they could, though many of them carried the same haunted look as the men they commanded, their eyes dulled by sleepless nights and the bitter cold, their thoughts divided between duty and the simple primal longing for warmth, for rest, for an end to the numbness that crept deeper into their bones. And still, even as positions fell one by one, as the perimeter shrank to a handful of streets and shells burst closer with each hour, the Sixth Army continued to exist in a strange suspended state, not yet defeated, not yet surrendered, but drifting toward an end that everyone felt, even if no one dared to name it aloud. For in Stalingrad, the final collapse did not come with a sudden crash, but with a long, slow, quiet unraveling, like the last thread slipping loose from a fraying cloth. And as the wind swept over the frozen ruins, carrying flecks of snow and ash through the empty windows of shattered factories, it whispered of an ending that was moving closer with every breath, though its arrival remained just beyond the line of sight. As the final days of January crept across Stalingrad with a slowness that felt almost deliberate, the cold seemed to deepen in a way that went beyond temperature, settling into the very structure of the ruins and the bones of the men who sheltered within them, until every movement, every breath, every quiet attempt to reorganize scattered units felt as though it was taking place beneath a heavy, invisible weight that pressed down on the entire encircled army. The pocket, once a broad arc stretching across the city and its outskirts, had tightened into a distorted cluster of positions centered around a few key strongpoints, and even these were beginning to fragment, each sector reduced to its own desperate struggle for warmth, food, and the barest semblance of order, while the carefully drawn lines on Paulus's maps no longer matched the shifting reality outside his headquarters. Radio operators, wrapped in blankets and leaning close to their sputtering equipment, struggled to maintain contact across distances that had once been trivial, but now felt immense as Soviet jamming, fuel shortages, and the physical collapse of units made each transmission an uncertain flicker in the darkness. And sometimes Paulus's staff found themselves calling out to divisions that no longer existed, receiving only silence in return. The Luftwaffe, its resources drained and its pilots exhausted, attempted to maintain the illusion of an air bridge, but the number of aircraft reaching the city dwindled to almost nothing, and on many days no engines were heard at all, leaving the soldiers to stare upward at an empty sky, where nothing moved but slow, drifting snowflakes, each one falling like a reminder that the world beyond the clouds had effectively let them go. Inside the headquarters, a dimly lit room buried beneath the ruins of a department store, Paulus paced slowly between the makeshift tables where officers sat hunched over reports written with trembling hands, and though he tried to project a calm presence, those who watched him carefully could see the deep lines etched into his face, lines that had grown sharper during the long nights without sleep, and the way he paused now and then as though searching for thoughts that slipped away just before he could form them fully. Outside, across the broken streets, German soldiers stood watch in positions so weakened that some outposts consisted of merely 3 or 4 men huddled behind a fallen wall, sharing a single functional weapon, their breath forming pale clouds that hung briefly before dissolving into the frigid air. And when Soviet artillery shells landed nearby, they reacted not with the fierce alertness of earlier months, but with a weary instinct, ducking slowly, returning fire mechanically, conserving both bullets and strength. In the southern pocket, word spread that Soviet troops were advancing steadily, not through dramatic assaults but through careful, methodical pressure, slipping between ruined buildings, cutting supply routes, isolating small clusters of defenders, and seizing ground that the Germans no longer had the energy to contest. And this advance, so quiet yet so steady, created a sense of inevitability that crept through the ranks like a cold mist. Yet in spite of this, a sense of routine persisted, as if the army's discipline had fused with desperation, and soldiers continued to perform tasks that no longer made sense, marking positions on maps, even when those positions had already been overrun, preparing fields of fire in sectors where ammunition was nearly gone, or writing brief reports to superiors who could no longer receive them. But these routines, hollow as they were, gave structure to the long hours and kept despair at bay. Rumors drifted between the pockets like faint echoes. Rumors that the Soviets, aware of the army's collapse, had called upon Paulus to surrender once more. Rumors that the High Command in Berlin refused to consider any such action. Rumors that Manstein was still planning something, or perhaps nothing at all. And rumors that senior officers whispered privately of disobeying orders, though none dared to speak such thoughts aloud in the presence of their men. At night, when temperatures plunged and the wind swept through shattered windows with a mournful sigh, soldiers lying in their shelters could hear faint movements in the distance. Soviet patrols probing forward, the occasional burst of gunfire, the creaking of ruined structures shifting under the cold, and each sound added to the growing sense that the fragile perimeter surrounding them was beginning to fray. Still, the Sixth Army endured, not through strength or hope, but through inertia, through the lingering momentum of months spent fighting in the ruins of a city that had drained them, of everything except the instinct to cling to whatever small patch of ground remained beneath their feet. And though collapse felt close, so close it seemed woven into the air itself, Stalingrad held its breath for just a few moments more, suspended between what had been and what was soon to come. As the final days of January slipped into the early hours of February, the shrinking German perimeter inside Stalingrad began to fracture in ways that were subtle at first, small gaps in the lines, outposts failing to report their status, patrols that did not return, and yet these subtle fractures soon merged into something larger, a slow but unmistakable unraveling that moved through the exhausted ranks with the quiet persistence of drifting snow, settling into every ruined crevice of the city. The northern pocket, which had once been a dense concentration of defensive positions anchored around the massive industrial complexes, now found itself reduced to a cluster of isolated strongpoints, separated by stretches of open ground, each position so weakened that some held only a handful of men, their uniforms stiff with frost and their eyes dulled by hunger, who crouched behind makeshift barricades assembled from bricks, twisted metal, and frozen earth. Southward, the situation was no different, as the last functioning mortar teams, their ammunition dwindling to single digits, chose their targets not based on strategic necessity, but on the simple desire to fire their remaining rounds with some sense of purpose, their weapons sputtering in the cold as though reluctant to continue the fight any longer. Inside the ruins, the sounds of battle had changed in character, no longer the constant roar of artillery and machine guns that had once swallowed every voice, but now a more sporadic, irregular series of bursts, short exchanges of fire, muffled explosions, and the occasional sharp crack of a rifle, echoing through the hollowed corridors of buildings that no longer resembled anything built for human habitation. Soviet troops moved forward with increasing confidence, though not carelessly, advancing building by building, checking cellars and stairwells, often pausing in surprise when they entered positions that had been abandoned without a struggle, finding rifles leaning against walls, cold cooking pots left beside small piles of ash, and personal belongings scattered as if the defenders had simply dissolved into the winter air. The German command staff, confined to their headquarters beneath the department store, found it increasingly difficult to construct a coherent picture of the battlefield, for each report they received contradicted the one before it, and many units failed to respond at all, leaving Paulus with maps marked not by precise front lines but by wide areas of uncertainty, blank spaces that expanded outward from the center like the spreading cracks of ice on a frozen lake. Officers sent out to make contact with distant positions often returned with only partial information, describing scenes of confusion, soldiers wandering through the snow in search of their companies, officers commanding groups of men they had never met, and pockets of resistance so disorganized that the front seemed to exist only as a memory of what it had once been, held together by the last threads of duty, rather than any practical ability to resist. In some sectors, German soldiers began to notice something strange in the behavior of the Soviets, an increased reluctance to fire unnecessarily, a quiet respect for the suffering of the defenders, and occasional moments when Soviet patrols passed by without engaging, as though recognizing that many of the Germans were no longer combatants in any meaningful sense, but simply men lingering in the ruins, their strength spent, their purpose fading. Even so, the pressure continued to grow, and Soviet commanders pushed their troops forward with a steady determination, knowing that the collapse was near, that the defenders were held in place not by strategy but by exhaustion, and that each advance, no matter how small, brought them closer to the inevitable disintegration of the Sixth Army's remaining cohesion. As the perimeter contracted further, it brought more and more soldiers within earshot of one another, so that the sounds of despair, coughing, and quiet conversations drifted across the ruins, blending with the sharp winds that carried fine particles of ice like drifting stars across the empty streets. And German soldiers found themselves speaking softly into the night, not of tactics or reinforcements, but of memories from home, of families, of warm summers long gone, and of a world that now felt impossibly distant from the frozen misery surrounding them. Inside the headquarters, the atmosphere had grown almost dreamlike, with officers moving slowly between maps and radios, speaking in hushed tones, as though the fragile silence might shatter if disturbed too abruptly, and the dim light cast long shadows across Paulus's face as he listened to reports that grew shorter, more fragmented, more despairing with each passing hour. And still, despite everything, the collapsing lines, the starving men, the relentless cold, there remained a strange thin layer of continuity, a sense that the Sixth Army had not yet fully surrendered to the darkness that pressed in from all sides, as though the final moment was being held back by some invisible thread, stretched impossibly thin but not yet broken, allowing the army to linger in a space between resistance and oblivion. For now, the ruins of Stalingrad remained suspended in a fragile balance, neither fully collapsed nor truly standing, and the breath of the winter wind whispered through the shattered beams and broken windows, carrying with it the faint and distant promise that the next movement of this frozen tragedy was coming soon, though not quite yet. As February's first breaths crept into Stalingrad, the shrinking pockets of German resistance began to resemble dim islands fading within a rising sea of Soviet control, each island smaller, weaker, more fractured than the day before, and the soldiers who clung to these fragments of ground moved through them not with purpose but with the slow, uncertain steps of men whose world had narrowed to a few streets, a few ruined rooms, a few hours of borrowed survival. The northern positions, once anchored by the towering silhouettes of factories and workshops, had dissolved into scattered defences that could no longer support one another. Squads found themselves isolated in windowless basements or collapsed stairwells, their only connection to the outside world the muffled sounds of distant fighting, and the faint crackle of dying radio lines that often faded before the message could be completed. In the southern pocket, conditions deteriorated even more rapidly, as Soviet forces tightened their encirclement with quiet determination, moving through the ruins with a methodical precision shaped by months of hard fighting, advancing step by step, doorway by doorway, checking for movement, clearing trenches, securing streets that had once echoed with the sharp crack of German rifles, but now lay buried beneath layers of snow and silence. German units, which at the beginning of the battle had boasted discipline and strength, now consisted of men whose uniforms hung loosely over starved bodies, whose faces were pale and hollowed, and whose hands trembled not from fear, but from the cold that seeped so deeply into their bones that even simple tasks, shouldering a rifle, tying a knot, lighting a small fire, required tremendous effort, as though gravity itself had grown heavier inside the encircled city. Paulus's headquarters had become a kind of surreal refuge, a place where officers moved through the dim, stagnant air with slow, deliberate motions, studying maps that no longer reflected reality, speaking to subordinates who commanded units that existed only in name, and sending requests to Berlin that came back as commands detached from the world around them, commands demanding defiance even as the structure needed to support that defiance crumbled one position at a time. In some districts, Soviet troops encountered pockets of German resistance that fought with a sudden, desperate energy, driven not by strategy but by instinct, firing their last rounds from behind piles of debris before retreating into deeper ruins, while in other sectors, they found positions where rifles lay unfired beside the lifeless hands of men who had simply frozen in their shelters overnight, their final moments marked not by violence, but by an exhaustion too profound to overcome. The Soviets, though advancing steadily, recognized the strange mix of despair and endurance that defined the Sixth Army's final days, and their approach reflected a cautious respect for the broken defenders, for they knew that even a starving soldier could be dangerous when cornered, and that every step forward had to be taken with both vigilance and restraint. At night, when the wind howled across the ruins like a restless spirit, and the moon cast a pale glow over the frozen streets, the Germans could hear the Soviets nearby, muted footsteps crunching softly through the snow, the metallic clink of equipment, quiet murmurings exchanged between patrols, and these sounds carried with them a strange duality: fear, because the enemy was close, and relief, because the presence of others, even adversaries, reminded them they were not entirely alone in the vast cold emptiness. Storms swept through the city with increasing intensity, filling trenches and shell craters with drifts of powdery snow that glowed faintly beneath the moonlight, covering bodies, weapons, and debris in a cold, shimmering veil, and the men who ventured out to check on neighboring positions often returned shaken, describing scenes that felt almost dreamlike, lines of footprints leading nowhere, fires extinguished by the wind, and shapes buried beneath the snow that they dared not investigate too closely. As days passed, the shrinking perimeter around Paulus contracted further, pulling his remaining men into a tighter and tighter knot of resistance, their world compressing into fewer and fewer blocks. And though no one spoke the words aloud, the collective understanding that the end was approaching settled over the Sixth Army like a quiet fog, heavy, unavoidable, and strangely calm. Still they held on, not because they expected to escape, nor because reinforcements were coming, but because in the final hours of a shattered army, holding on became its own form of identity, a last thread connecting them to the memory of what they had been before the winter, before the hunger, before the ruins of Stalingrad consumed their strength. And even as Soviet troops prepared their final push, tightening their grip around the diminishing German defences, the city itself seemed to pause, as though waiting for the next breath, the next shift, the next whisper of movement that would push the Sixth Army one step closer to the breaking point that everyone could feel but no one could yet see. As the last hours of January gave way to the cold, pale dawns of early February, the shrinking world of the Sixth Army contracted even further around General Paulus's headquarters, drawing the remaining soldiers inward as though the entire city were folding in on itself, and the sense of confinement grew so intense that the air inside the underground rooms felt heavy, stale, and almost warm compared to the cutting cold above. Paulus, once a precise and deliberate commander, now moved through his command posts with a mechanical slowness, stopping often to steady himself against the rough concrete pillars as he read reports that offered less and less clarity, reports written hurriedly by officers whose hands trembled from cold and exhaustion, notes scribbled on torn pieces of map paper, and radio messages that cut out mid-sentence, leaving him to guess whether the silence that followed was due to interference or the loss of yet another outpost. The command structure, once rigid and functional, now felt like a web stretched too thin, its strands snapping one by one as units vanished into the snow-covered ruins, and officers who attempted to re-establish order returned with haunted expressions, saying that companies had dissolved, platoons were scattered, and men drifted between positions like shadows, unsure where they were needed, unsure whether they belonged to any unit at all. In the narrow streets above, soldiers stumbled through drifts of snow that rose nearly to their knees, passing the dark forms of buildings stripped bare by months of bombardment, where shattered windows resembled empty eye sockets staring blankly into the white void, and the sound of their boots crunching through ice was occasionally interrupted by the distant pop of a rifle or the heavy thud of a mortar, though even these sounds came less frequently now. Communication between the pockets had become nearly impossible, and Paulus was forced to rely on incomplete fragments, piecing together the fate of his remaining forces from brief, disjointed messages. One unit pushed back from the Barricady factory to a line they could no longer hold, another losing half its strength to frostbite in a single night, and a third reporting that ammunition had run out completely, leaving only bayonets and desperation with which to face the Soviet advance. Soviet artillery continued to hammer the shrinking perimeter, though with a rhythm that suggested not urgency but method, as though they too understood that the Sixth Army was unravelling from within, and each barrage sent waves of dust and broken plaster drifting down into the headquarters corridors, coating the maps and telephones with a thin film of grey that officers brushed away with weary, resigned motions. Some soldiers inside the pocket, pushed by hunger and exhaustion to the edge of delirium, began to wander from their assigned positions, searching for food or shelter, and were occasionally seen stumbling into Soviet lines with hands raised, their surrender unplanned, silent, and driven not by fear but by the simple, overwhelming need to escape the cold that clawed at their bones. Others, still clinging to discipline, held their trenches with a kind of muted defiance, firing at advancing Soviet patrols with the last rounds they possessed, then settling back into the snow, waiting for the next movement, their breath visible in the frozen air, drifting upward like small ghosts. Inside the department store basement, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that hardly needed words, for every officer and orderly felt the weight of what was coming, yet none dared speak of it openly. Instead, they moved through their routines with quiet determination, checking radios, updating maps, passing messages along hallways dimly lit by lanterns whose flames flickered in the drafts that crept through even the deepest corners. Encrypted messages from Berlin still arrived, but they felt increasingly disconnected from the siege tightening around them, full of instructions that no longer matched reality, and hints of promotions or expectations that felt hollow when every sound outside the bunker reminded them that time was slipping away. In these final days before the breaking point, a strange calm settled over the defenders, an acceptance that had nothing to do with surrender, nothing to do with hope, but something closer to a profound quiet, as though the city itself had absorbed every ounce of fear, leaving behind only exhaustion and a fragile willingness to face whatever came next. And still, despite everything, the collapsing lines, the freezing nights, the shadows of Soviet troops drawing ever closer, there remained a faint echo of resistance in the ruins, a lingering thread that connected the scattered men of the Sixth Army to one another and kept them moving, hour by hour, through a world that had grown impossibly small and unbearably cold. It was not yet the end, but it was close enough that the soldiers felt its presence in the air, in the silence between artillery volleys, in the tightening of the Soviet noose, and in the slow, steady rhythm of their own breathing, as they waited for the next day to arrive. As the encirclement drew tighter around what remained of the German Sixth Army, the world inside Polis's headquarters shrank to a dimly lit labyrinth of concrete corridors, narrow rooms and flickering lanterns that cast long, wavering shadows across the faces of officers, too tired to hide the strain that carved itself deeper into their expressions each day, giving the entire bunker the feeling of a ship slowly sinking beneath a frozen sea. The basement of the department store, once merely a temporary command post, had become the beating heart of an army that no longer had limbs strong enough to obey its commands, and every hour the room seemed to grow smaller, the stale air heavier, the silence deeper, as though the very structure was absorbing the desperation of the men inside it. Maps that once charted ambitious offensives across thousands of kilometers had been reduced to small sections, marked with red circles and arrows pointing inward, symbols that reflected not strategy but the slow retreat of existence. And Polis would stand over them for long periods, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid yet his breath shallow, as though he were listening for something far beyond the bunker walls, some sign, some shift, some whisper of possibility that stubbornly refused to come. Outside, the Soviets advanced through the ruins with a growing confidence, moving not in large waves but in steady, deliberate steps, probing every corner and tunnel of the shattered city, clearing buildings one room at a time, closing the ring in a way that left fewer and fewer routes for the Germans to move, until even messengers had to sprint across open spaces or abandoned streets with their heads down, hoping the next shell would land just a little farther away. The radio room, once bustling with coded chatter, now felt like a place haunted by silence, for the operators sat hunched over their equipment, listening to crackling static that rarely resolved into coherent transmissions, and when messages did come through, they were short, fragmented, often ending mid-sentence, as if the units sending them had been swallowed by the white fog and the gunfire before they could finish speaking. Officers who left the headquarters to check on nearby positions returned with stories that felt more like murmured dreams than military reports. Trenches occupied by 3 men instead of 30, machine gun nests frozen in place with barrels iced over, sentries who had fallen asleep standing up and then collapsed into the snow without waking, and entire squads huddled in cellars with blank gazes, unable to speak from cold and hunger. And yet, occasionally they also brought back brief glimpses of stubborn resistance. A small group of grenadiers who refused to abandon a ruined intersection despite being completely surrounded, or a medic who had somehow managed to tend to wounded soldiers with nothing more than cloth torn from his own uniform, and the faint, fading warmth of his hands. Inside the bunker, conversations grew slower and quieter. Even the sound of boots on the concrete floors softened, as though the men who walked those corridors were afraid of disturbing the delicate balance that kept the bunker from collapsing inward. The murmured exchanges between officers felt heavy, not because of secrecy, but because of the weight of unspoken understanding that hung between every word. Berlin continued to send messages, some promising relief, others demanding steadfastness, all of them detached from the reality that Paulus and his officers could see simply by stepping outside the bunker's entrance and gazing toward the smoke columns rising less than a kilometer away. But even those messages arrived with decreasing frequency, as though the airwaves themselves were thinning. The temperature inside the bunker hovered just above freezing, enough to keep the men alive but not enough to bring warmth, and many wrapped themselves in blankets or greatcoats, their breath drifting visibly as they worked, while the lantern flames trembled in the drafts that found their way into even the deepest corners of the headquarters. On the surface, the city felt eerily still between Soviet assaults, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of artillery or the thin whine of the wind passing through broken windows and shattered roofs. Patrols returning to the bunker often described Stalingrad in these final days as a place caught between worlds, no longer a battlefield, not yet a grave, existing in a suspended state where time seemed to hesitate, as though waiting for the moment when the last thread holding everything together would finally give way. Even the Soviets, pressing closer each day, advanced with a strange mixture of caution and inevitability, aware that the defenders were exhausted, starving, and fragmented, yet still understanding that these remnants, however weakened, were capable of sudden bursts of desperate resistance from pockets of men too far gone to fear death. And so, inside the department store basement, where the lanterns flickered and the maps curled at the edges from damp and cold, Paulus and his staff continued to work in the half-light, aware that their shrinking world was approaching a boundary, a threshold that once crossed would leave no room for messages, maps, or orders, only the stark reality of a decision waiting quietly just beyond the next sunrise. The city, the winter, and history itself seemed to hold their breath, as though all three sensed the moment drawing near. But not yet. Not quite. In the early hours of February 2nd, 1943, as the pale winter light crept slowly over the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the last threads holding the Sixth Army together finally gave way, not with a dramatic final battle, nor with a roar of defiance, but with a quiet, exhausted surrender that felt less like a decision and more like the inevitable exhale of an army that had reached the absolute limits of what a human being can endure. By then, the northern and southern pockets had ceased to function as coherent forces, their lines collapsing inward, until Paulus's command post lay at the very center of a world reduced to a few smoldering blocks, and Soviet troops advancing through the ruins met little resistance, only scattered groups of starving men who raised white cloths tied to rifle barrels, or simply stood motionless, unable to lift their weapons. Inside the bunker beneath the department store, Paulus sat wrapped in his greatcoat, his breath visible in the cold air, as Soviet envoys approached to demand the inevitable. A day earlier, Hitler had promoted him to field marshal, hoping to bind him to a tradition that no German officer of that rank had ever surrendered. But Paulus, his face drawn, his body trembling from exhaustion, understood that for his men no further resistance was possible. And so, in a tone as quiet as the snow falling outside, he refused to order anyone to die for a ruined city that no longer existed. When Soviet troops entered the bunker, there was no struggle, no final stand, only the weary silence of men who had survived too much to pretend anymore. Across the scattered pockets of resistance, similar scenes unfolded. Small clusters of soldiers emerged from cellars, trenches, and collapsed buildings, their hands raised, their movements slow and uncertain, as though they were stepping out of a long, terrible dream. Some were so weak they had to be carried. Others simply sat down in the snow, unable to muster the strength to walk toward captivity. In all directions, the city was filled with the soft sound of surrender, boots crunching gently through ice, muffled orders in Russian, and the deep, shuddering breaths of men who had finally stopped fighting against a fate sealed weeks earlier. By nightfall, the last organized resistance had faded completely, and Stalingrad, once a proud symbol of Soviet industry, now stood as a vast, broken monument to human endurance and human suffering. The battle had consumed nearly 2 million lives, leaving behind a landscape so scarred that even the wind seemed to hesitate as it passed through the skeletal remains of factories, apartment blocks, and frozen trenches. For the Germans, the aftermath was devastating. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, only a fraction would ever return home, and many of those who survived captivity carried the memories of Stalingrad in their eyes for the rest of their lives. Memories of fire, hunger, cold, and the slow unraveling of everything they had believed unbreakable. For the Soviets, Stalingrad became a turning point, a victory paid for in unimaginable sacrifice, but one that signaled the beginning of the long push westward across the rivers, forests, and plains that separated them from Berlin. And for the world, the name Stalingrad entered the history books, not merely as a battle, but as a symbol of something far deeper. The moment when an entire war shifted, when an empire bent under the weight of its own ambition, and when ordinary soldiers on both sides faced the limits of their strength beneath a sky of ice and smoke. As night settled once again over the ruined city, a strange stillness returned, replacing months of ceaseless violence with a silence so complete it felt sacred. And in that silence, the Volga flowed on, indifferent and eternal, carrying with it the echo of everything that had happened on its frozen shores. Stalingrad had fallen, but in falling, it had changed the course of history forever.